In June 2025, Iran fired 900 ballistic missiles and 1,000 armed drones at Israel, the largest missile campaign in the history of the Islamic Republic. The largest single barrage of ballistic missiles ever directed at any nation in the modern era. And yet, and this is the part that almost nobody understood clearly in the immediate aftermath, it mostly failed. Not because Iran ran out of missiles, not because its launchers were all destroyed, but because the overwhelming majority of those 900 missiles were intercepted, because the air defense network held, because the asymmetry of the June 2025 war was devastatingly clear. Iran threw its largest punch ever, and Israel and the United States largely absorbed it. The ceasefire came, the analysis began. And inside Iran's military establishment, inside the IRGC's operational planning cells, inside the newly reconstituted National Defense Council that Iran created in the direct aftermath of that humiliating strategic outcome, a fundamental question was asked. If 900 missiles is not enough, if the largest barrage we have ever fired does not break Israeli defenses or change American calculations, then what will? The answer that Iran developed between July 2025 and February 2026, the doctrine revision, the institutional restructuring, the strategic pivot, is the answer that is now being executed across 8 countries simultaneously in a conflict that looks nothing like the 12-day war that preceded it. Tonight, we decode that answer completely from the beginning. To understand where Iran's military strategy is today, you have to understand with unflinching clarity what the June 2025 12-day war actually taught Iran about its own capabilities and its own limits. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion on June 13, 2025, striking Iran's nuclear infrastructure, targeting senior military commanders and nuclear scientists, and destroying significant elements of Iran's air defense network in the opening hours. Iran responded with what it described as its largest ever missile campaign, 900 ballistic missiles and 1,000 armed drones, directed at Israeli population centers and military infrastructure. By any historical metric, it was an extraordinary military act. The outcome was strategically catastrophic for Iran. The Foreign Policy Research Institute's comprehensive post-war analysis, published in October 2025, was unsparing. Iran failed to achieve its political and military objectives. The campaign undermined the regime's credibility, revealed the limits of its deterrence, and intensified internal debates about its future. The 900 missiles were largely intercepted. The damage in Israel, 28 civilians killed, was, as the FPRI analysis noted, limited compared to the scale of the assault. The asymmetry was stark. Then the United States entered. American B-2 bombers, carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, the largest non-nuclear bombs in the American arsenal, specifically designed to destroy deeply buried fortified targets, struck Iran's underground nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. President Trump declared that Iran's nuclear capabilities had been neutralized. A ceasefire brokered by Oman took effect on June 24th, and then the reckoning began. Iran's currency entered freefall in the aftermath. International sanctions were tightened further in September 2025. The protests that had been simmering since the economic crisis of late 2025 erupted into the largest demonstrations since the 1979 Islamic Revolution in December, spreading across Iran through January 2026. Protests that Iranian security forces suppressed with a reported death toll of anywhere between 3,000 and 30,000 people, depending on the source. Iran had fought its biggest war and lost strategically. Its nuclear program was struck, its economy was collapsing, its population was on the streets demanding change, and its adversaries were visibly preparing for the next round. This is the context in which Iran's military establishment conducted its post-war strategic review, and the conclusions it reached changed everything. The Middle East Council on Global Affairs published a detailed analysis of Iran's strategic reassessment in the aftermath of June 2025, identifying 3 core conclusions that emerged from the post-war debates within the Iranian strategic establishment. These 3 lessons are the foundation of everything Iran is doing differently in the current conflict. The first lesson: negotiations can yield a balanced outcome only when backed by a credible willingness for military confrontation. In other words, diplomacy without demonstrated military capability is surrender by another name. The JCPOA, the nuclear deal that Iran entered in 2015, which collapsed when the United States withdrew in 2018, had, from Iran's perspective, produced sanctions relief in exchange for nuclear concessions without actually protecting Iran from military attack. The June 2025 war proved that diplomatic engagement had not deterred Israel or the United States from striking when they judged the strategic moment favorable. Iran's strategic establishment concluded that it had negotiated from weakness and that the only path to negotiating from strength was the demonstrated capacity to impose unacceptable costs on any adversary who chose to attack. The second lesson: diplomacy should never constrain Iran's military readiness. In the months before the June 2025 war erupted, Iran and the United States were engaged in indirect nuclear negotiations facilitated by Oman. Iranian officials later concluded that these negotiations had created a degree of restraint in Iran's posture, a reluctance to take aggressive preparatory military actions that might appear to contradict the diplomatic channel. That restraint, they concluded, had made Iran more vulnerable by providing Israel and the United States with a window in which Iran was diplomatically constrained from military escalation. The lesson: never again. Military preparedness and diplomatic engagement would proceed simultaneously and independently. The third and most strategically consequential lesson: Iran's ability to impose meaningful costs in response to any attack increases prospects for a diplomatic breakthrough while discouraging American enthusiasm for confrontation. This is the lesson that translates most directly into the current military campaign. If Iran can demonstrate, not just claim, but demonstrate, that attacking it produces a regional war involving 9 countries, a Hormuz threat, a global energy price spike, a cascade of civilian infrastructure attacks, and an open-ended attrition campaign costing the United States billions of dollars per week, then the cost-benefit calculation of any future attack on Iran shifts. Deterrence is rebuilt not by threatening what you will do, but by showing what you can do. The current conflict is that demonstration. One of the most significant and least covered developments in Iran's military restructuring after June 2025 was institutional rather than operational: the reconstitution of the National Defense Council. The National Defense Council was originally created during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s and was replaced by the Supreme National Security Council in 1989. For 35 years, Iran's military planning operated through the SNSC, a structure that critics within the Iranian system felt was too slow, too bureaucratic, and insufficiently integrated across the parallel military structures that define Iran's defense architecture. The 12-day war exposed these structural problems in ways that could not be ignored. Iran operates parallel armies: the Artesh, the regular military responsible for conventional defense, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, responsible for the missile forces, drone programs, proxy networks, and the most strategically significant military capabilities. These parallel structures have different chains of command, different loyalties, and historically imperfect coordination mechanisms. Iran's post-June 2025 response involved launching a massive simultaneous salvo. But the coordination failures that analysts identified in the timing and targeting of that salvo reflected the institutional gaps between the parallel military structures. The National Defense Council, reconstituted under the Supreme National Security Council in the aftermath of the war, was specifically designed to address this problem. According to its charter, it is chaired by the President and composed of the Parliament Speaker, the Judiciary Head, top military commanders from both the Artesh and the IRGC, and the Ministers of Defense, Intelligence, and Foreign Affairs. Its mandate, as the FPRI analysis described it, is centralizing military planning, enhancing interagency coordination, and facilitating rapid crisis response. In other words, Iran built a wartime command structure where before it had a peacetime consultative body. The results of that institutional restructuring are visible in the current conflict. The coordination between IRGC missile forces, regular Army air defense remnants, proxy networks across 9 countries, and the maritime forces threatening Hormuz is more integrated than anything Iran executed in June 2025. The campaign is not 900 missiles fired in 2 waves. It is a sustained, multi-week, multi-country, multi-domain operation, precisely the kind of campaign the National Defense Council was built to coordinate. Here is the most significant and most dangerous strategic evolution in Iran's military doctrine since the 12-day war, and it is one that received almost no attention in Western media until Iran's Defense Council made it official in a January 6, 2026 statement less than 2 months before the current conflict began. For the entire history of the Islamic Republic, Iran's deterrence model rested on what strategists call second strike logic. Iran would absorb an initial attack, then respond with calibrated but painful retaliation. This was the doctrine of an asymmetric power that knew it could not win a conventional first strike campaign against American and Israeli air power, so it built its deterrence around making the cost of attacking it too high to bear, through proxy escalation, missile retaliation, and economic disruption. Don't start the fight. Make finishing the fight too expensive. The June 2025 war revealed the critical vulnerability of this doctrine. If Iran waits to be struck first, it absorbs the first blow, and the first blow, as June 2025 demonstrated, can include the destruction of its air defenses, the killing of its senior commanders, the targeting of its nuclear infrastructure. Second strike logic assumes you have a viable second strike capacity after absorbing the first blow. Israel and America's June 2025 campaign was specifically designed to degrade that capacity before Iran could respond. On January 6, 2026, Iran's newly established Defense Council issued a statement that represented a formal break from 4 decades of second strike doctrine. While reaffirming Iran's claim that it does not seek war, the Council declared that Tehran no longer considers itself limited to responding after an attack and would treat objective signs of threat as part of its security calculus. In the careful language of strategic doctrine, this is an enormous statement. Iran was announcing a shift toward what the Middle East Council for Global Affairs called anticipatory defense, the right to act preemptively when it perceives clear signs of imminent danger rather than waiting to absorb a first strike. This doctrine change was published publicly, it was read in Washington, it was read in Jerusalem, and 6 weeks later, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, choosing apparently to test whether the anticipatory defense doctrine would actually be executed or whether it was deterrence posturing. What has followed is the answer to that test. Here is the closing thought that I want to leave you with tonight, drawn from British security analyst John Phillips, one of the clearest voices in the current analysis of Iran's strategic situation. Phillips described Iran as a wounded animal, an animal that has lost its supreme leader, lost much of its nuclear infrastructure, lost 80% of its air defenses, lost 60% of its missile launchers, watched its economy implode and its population revolt, and yet, despite all of this, has demonstrated that it can still launch meaningful missile and drone attacks across 9 countries simultaneously, still force the United States into what Phillips called a sustained, resource-intensive, defensive and offensive campaign rather than a clean one-off disarmament. A wounded animal is dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than an uninjured one, because it has nothing left to lose strategically, because its only remaining viable path to institutional survival is to make the cost of not reaching a settlement higher than the cost of reaching one. Because every week of sustained fire is a week of interceptor depletion, economic disruption, and political pressure that moves the United States and its allies incrementally closer to asking, is there a deal here? And if so, what does it look like? Look, Iran emerged from the 12-day war of June 2025 humiliated, restructured, and transformed. It drew 3 strategic lessons, rebuilt its command architecture, pivoted its doctrine from second strike to anticipatory defense, and when the next war came, launched in conditions less favorable than any since the Iran-Iraq War, it executed a campaign categorically different from the one it ran in June 2025, more sustained, more distributed, more strategically coherent, aimed not at winning a battle, but at winning the argument about whether this war should continue at all. The 12-day war taught Iran what it could not do. The current conflict is Iran demonstrating what it learned. Stay with us, because this is the most consequential strategic story of our generation.